Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. Gary Zacharias, you're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. Let me give you a couple of scenarios and see what you would say. So you're at a dinner party. You got some friends around, and one person says, I don't believe in God. It's just not rational. There's no proof. And there's a lot of silence. What would you say? Here's a second scenario. You're at your weekly Bible study group, and one person who's a newcomer says, well, who are we to say Christianity is better than any other religion? I mean, the essence of Jesus' teaching is love, and that's what all religions say. It's not our job to tell other people how to live or believe. And then again, there's silence. How would you respond? Here's a third scene. You're riding on a bus at a university. You got a friend who notices you digging around in your backpack and sees a Bible. Oh, he says, I've read the Bible before. It's got some interesting stories, but people take it too seriously. I mean, it was only written by men after all, and men make mistakes. Okay, what would you say? Fourth scenario. You're at a car dealership waiting for your car to be serviced. You're sitting there with some other people watching a little television, and something comes on about a religious group. And the person next to you says out loud, haven't these people ever heard of separation of church and state? Those Christians are always trying to force their views on everyone else. You can't legislate morality. Why don't they just leave the rest of us alone? Well, you're around other people. Maybe you feel like you should let it go, but a lot of people are hearing that. What would you say? So these are four scenarios that Koukl brings up in his book called Tactics. And of course, the subtitle is what explains it all. It's a game plan, he says, for discussing your Christian convictions. And I'll tell you, this book is so practical. Koukl wrote it, and he's, of course, the founder and the president of Stand to Reason. That's str.org. Actually, I think he just turned over the leadership to Alan Schleman. Maybe they're doing it together right now. So Koukl has put out several really good books. His website is amazing. I really suggest you go to that site if you have any time at all and take a look. It's about 99% free, all sorts of good material. Of course, they do sell books and all. And if you have one book to put on your bookshelf to help you with your Christianity, dealing with other people, this is probably it, Tactics. And this is the updated and expanded version that I'm going to talk about today. It's the 10th anniversary edition. I would definitely suggest you get that one. Yeah, you may find some of the first edition available, but this one is not just a couple of pages further. It's, I don't know, it's like 25% larger. So it's got a lot of new information. So I'd like to get to chapter 3 today. I've already done a podcast on the first two chapters. So here's chapter 3. It's called the Columbo tactic. So I gave you those scenarios. You know, what do you do? Well, you feel awkward and you want to say something, but you know you should be sensitive. You don't want to get people upset. You want to keep your friendships. You don't want to look like some kind of weird extremist. And so Koukl says, what if I told you there was an easy escape from that challenge? A way to get rid of the awkwardness and actually to get a good conversation going with grace. He said it's a simple plan. So he said, we'll get to that in just a minute. He said, let's take those challenges that came up in those scenarios. Notice how Koukl would maneuver here. So challenge number 1, it's not rational to believe in God. There's no proof. Koukl says, what do you mean by God? What kind of God are you rejecting? What is it that's irrational about believing in God? What kind of evidence would you find acceptable for God's existence? What arguments for God have you considered? And what did you find wrong with them? Challenge number 2. Christianity is basically the same as all other religions. I mean, they're all talking about love. We shouldn't tell others how to live or believe. Koukl says we could ask questions here. How much have you studied other religions? Why would the similarities be more important than the differences? What do you think Jesus' attitude was in this issue? Did he think all religions were basically equal? Challenge 3. You can't take the Bible too seriously because it was only written by men and men make mistakes. Okay, do you have any books in your library? Do you find any truth in those books? They're written by people. Is there a reason you think the Bible's less truthful or reliable than other books? Do people always make mistakes in what they write? Do you think if God did exist, he'd be able to use humans to write down exactly what he wanted? Fourth challenge. It's wrong to force your views on other people. You can't legislate morality. Christians involved in politics violate the separation of church and state. Koukl says, how about a response like this? Do you vote? When you vote for someone, are you expecting your candidate to pass laws reflecting your point of view? Wouldn't that essentially be forcing your views on others? How is that different from what you're troubled about here? Are you saying maybe only non-religious people should be allowed to vote or participate in politics? Where specifically in the Constitution are religious people excluded from the political process because of their spiritual convictions? Don't all laws force a morality of some sort? So Koukl says, I want you to notice something. First, he says, these are questions. So notice Koukl doesn't jump in immediately and say, you're wrong, here's why I'm right, and come up with a long dissertation, a real argument. He says, no. He says, I would just like to draw the people out, invite them to talk more about what they think. He said, these questions are an invitation to thoughtful dialogue, not just to shut somebody down. So he says, this is the best of all tactics. It's so flexible and so adaptable. Now, he hasn't talked about it yet, but he said it's a game plan. It provides a step-by-step guide. He said you can use it with other moves that you'll learn about later. He says it's the simplest tactic imaginable to stop a challenger in his or her tracks, turn the tables, and get that person thinking. It puts you in the driver's seat of a conversation. He says he calls it the Columbo tactic. Why that? Well, for those of you old enough, and if you're young, you won't recognize this, but there in an old television series, there was an old series about a guy who was a police detective, Lieutenant Columbo. And he would come on the scene, and he looked like he just got out of bed. His hair was a mess. He had a trench coat, but it was just rumpled and nasty looking. Had a cigar in his stubby fingers and fumbled around. He couldn't find his pencil or pen. He had to borrow a pen off somebody else. He looks inept. He looks harmless. He's like a fox, though, because he has a plan. So he pokes around the crime scene. He scratches his head and kind of mutters to himself. And then he says, I got a problem, as he looks around. There's something about this thing that bothers me. And he turns to the suspect. You seem like an intelligent person. Maybe you can clear it up for me. Do you mind if I ask you a question? And usually it's a very simple question. The person is not put off or worried or feeling threatened and seems satisfied. And then Columbo says, oh, okay. And he starts to leave, but he says, wait, just one more thing. But then that one more question leads to another and leads to another, and pretty soon he says, I know I'm making a pest of myself. It's just my habit. But as he asks these questions, he rattles that person, and eventually he solves the case. So he says, why would you ask questions? What's the value of asking questions? He says, well, if you do a frontal assault on people with all your reasons and why they're wrong, you're going to get a lot of pushback. He said, asking a question, though, is friendly. It's flattering. You're focusing on the other person and his or her ideas. You're showing interest. And then he says, secondly, you're going to get an education. You're going to leave the conversation knowing a lot more than when you arrived. And that might be helpful. He gave an example. He said he was talking to another Christian who asked him one time, could you tell me about a book on Buddhism? So Koukl said, why do you want the book? Notice he's asking a question. And he said, well, I want to bone up on the basics of the religion so I could witness. And Koukl said, well, why don't you skip the book and just go talk to the Buddhist? Okay, a third thing that's good about questions, it allows you to make progress on a point without being pushy. Because most of these questions are neutral. They don't sound like you're preaching. They don't sound like you're shoving your view down their throat. There's another benefit, he said. Questions buy you time when you're really not sure what to do next. The pressure's off. You can just relax and enjoy the conversation and see where it goes. And he says, finally, and what he says is most important, if you put questions down, you're in the driver's seat of the conversation. You control it. You can judge when somebody grows uneasy. You just change directions. He says Jesus did this a lot. Notice in Luke 20:24, he says, show me a denarius, a coin. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? In Luke 20, verse 4, was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? Mark 2:9, Jesus says to the crowd there, which is easier to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and pick up your pallet and walk? He knew there was power by asking questions, and he had a purpose. It wasn't just, oh, okay, that's good to know. He was going somewhere with the information that he would eventually be able to use. So he said, when you're starting out and you're just developing your game plan, you're coming up with these Columbo questions, he said, don't be concerned about what comes next. You don't know what's going to come next. Just forget about the end game. So just start out and just see what happens. And you could just ask the questions. And if they gave you an answer that puzzled you or you weren't sure where to go next, you can just say, thanks, that's good, that's clear. Or you could say, let me think about that. It's interesting. I'll come back to you. So you can always come back to them. So as the chapter wraps up, Koukl says, here's a summary. So I like that. At the end of every chapter, there's a summary. So he said, think about the Columbo tactic. It's a disarming way to go on the offensive with questions that produce a conversation that'll follow. It's a good starter of a conversation. It's interactive. It's neutral. You're not going to get preachy. Helps you make some headway without stating your case. It helps you understand the other person. It buys some time, and they keep you in the driver's seat of the conversation. So let's go to chapter 4. So we just did 3. Let's do 4. I did a previous podcast on the first 2 chapters, so I'm kind of walking through this book. And this is important. This book, I think it's really important to walk your way through rather than just pick a chapter somewhere and start. You're better off to just take it in order. So chapter 4, he says, gathering information. So he said, why are you asking these questions? Get information from the other person before you move on, so you can begin to figure out what it's all about, what's going on with this person. So he said, I once had a chat with a young professional named John on a flight. So when he learned that Koukl was a Christian, he informed me, I'm not a Christian. None of my friends are. He said, I used to be a Christian, but I'm not one anymore. So Koukl says, do you think that particular detail was important? He said, yeah. He said, there was more to it. John later added, I used to be a preacher's kid. And then says, that surprised Greg Koukl. How'd you used to be a preacher's kid? Did your dad die? No, he's just not a preacher anymore. He's not even a Christian. Koukl says, yikes. Was that important to know? Do you think there might be some emotional baggage there? There was. So Koukl said, I asked more questions. I let him talk. And he found out this guy had had some bad experiences with Christians and the church. So that helped him figure out how to approach the next set of questions and all. So it said, I heard more about his painful experiences. I was able to maneuver around those hazards. So he said, just let the person explain, give them a question, let them explain, let them clarify, let them defend. Don't attack, don't get defensive, just listen carefully. So, of course, everybody's going to say, well, what's a good model question to get going? How do you get started? Koukl says, here's the one I use. What do you mean by that? So somebody says to you, I don't believe in evolution. Or I'm sorry, they say to you, I believe in evolution. You say, what do you mean by evolution? There's more than one kind. Somebody says to you, oh, there's so much evil in the world. Your question could be, what do you mean by evil? What makes bad things bad? That sounds obvious, but that's actually a very subtle, interesting question. Here's a third one. You don't take the Bible literally, do you? You could say, well, what do you mean by literally? Somebody else says to you, science has proved there's no God. Really? How did science do that? Now, let me feed you a statement and see how you would respond. What would be a good question that basically is, what do you mean by that? So if somebody says to you, abortion is okay because a fetus is a human, but not a person. Okay, let me say that one again. Abortion is okay because a fetus is a human, but not a person. What question could you ask them? Here's one. It's pretty simple. What's the difference between the two? You say it's a human, but not a person. What's the difference? So you got all sorts of advantages. You're engaging that person in an interactive way. You're not driving them away from you. It says you're asking these questions because you don't want to misunderstand the person. You don't want to misrepresent them. You don't want the person to confused themselves. They may not actually know stuff very well. And that's a really good point. Okay, it says, if you don't understand that person's point, you may be representing it, which is a really big problem. He said the hope is that it helps the other person be more clear in his or her own mind. He said, oftentimes people say things and they've confused themselves. People don't really know what they mean. Now, Koukl says it sounds surprising, but it's true. People have strong opinions, but they don't reflect on their views, and they're just repeating slogans. And when you ask them, well, could you explain that? Then they're stuck. They have to think about what they mean. So be patient with a pause in the dialogue. He says asking questions is the simplest way to clear up confusion and deal with ambiguities. Yeah, I think that's a good point. You're allowing the other person to do more of the talking so you can get a much clearer picture of what's going on. Koukl says, be sure you pay attention to the response. Don't just throw a question out and then zone out. I mean, if the meaning is unclear, follow up. Say something like, how exactly does that work? Or, can you clarify that for me? Or, I'm not sure what you're getting at. So you're going to get more details. So he says that question is powerful. He said, don't underestimate it. So he said, let's go back to those scenarios, those 4 scenarios. He said, why did Koukl pick those questions that he did? He said, here's my thinking. One person says it's not rational to believe in a God. And he says the challenge was to tell that person to come up with what kind of God was being rejected. He said for some people, God's an old man with a beard sitting on a throne out in space somewhere. He said if that's the kind of God they don't believe in, I agree with him. I don't believe in that kind of God either. Some reject a personal God, but they believe in an impersonal God force. Or maybe he's dealing with an atheist, but he said, I need more information. So that's a good point. He said, just be careful when somebody says there's no proof of God's existence. He said, oftentimes you can give them all sorts of evidence and they're going to put it down. They're going to say, no, that's not good enough. That's not proof. And so you're really getting nowhere. Here's another charge. God is irrational. He says, I'm not going to let that person off the hook. I want him to tell me specifically how theism, believing there's a God, is at odds with good thinking. Yeah, that's a good point. He says there's nothing irrational or unreasonable about the idea of a personal God creating the universe. I mean, look around. Scientists now say that a Big Bang was used to get the universe started. Well, a Big Bang, as Koukl says, needs a big banger. Somebody's got to get that thing going. Something had to bring the universe into existence. Then you've got DNA. What's DNA? It's computer code. Well, you need a computer analyst. You need somebody that's a designer to come up, an engineer of some kind, to do that blueprint, to create the DNA. A moral law needs a moral lawgiver. So he said these all make complete sense. They're not blind leaps of faith. So asking what's irrational about believing in God, he said that's a very good question. He said then there's the challenge about Christianity is the same as all other religions. But he said that's religious pluralism. And he said there are all sorts of weaknesses in that, which I agree. I mean, that's a pretty naive understanding of other religions, Koukl says. They're wildly different in their beliefs. Yeah, that's a good point. He said, what do you think Jesus' attitude was on the issue? He said Jesus was not a pluralist. You can find that out pretty easily. What about the third challenge? Oh, we shouldn't take the Bible too seriously. It was only written by men. He says the key word here is only. He said it presumes that the Bible is just a human document. But he said it's more of a fundamental problem. He says fallible people can still get their facts right. He says if they can, why not Paul and Peter and John or Luke? He's saying my goal is modest. I think it's a good point here. All he's trying to do, as Koukl says, is to put a stone in the person's shoe. Just get the person thinking. I want them to consider listening to Jesus. So he said, if you want skeptics to believe in the Bible, don't get into a tug of war with them about inspiration. He said, invite them to engage with Jesus' words firsthand. Let the Spirit do the heavy lifting for you. And I might just add my own personal story here. I used to teach the Bible as literature, and I had a pretty rough guy, tough guy in the class. And after the semester was out, I thought, boy, I hope some of that got through, but I couldn't tell from class. But he sent me a note later and he said, when I started the class, my life was a mess, but the Bible really spoke to me. And he said he's become a Christian. So I've interacted with him over the years, and he has. He's a dedicated Christian, got a wife, 2 kids, and it just pleased me no end that I didn't do the work at all. It was the Holy Spirit working in the Bible. So the heavy lifting comes from the Holy Spirit, not us. What about another challenge he said about these objections about it's wrong to politically force views on people? He said, yeah, but people in the legislative process do that all the time. And that's their point, is when they pass a law, they are forcing it on other people. Okay, so do you see in this chapter, he's talking about, what do you mean by that, is his good question. Yeah, that is a very, very good question. So he said, try using that form. He said, it's very valuable. He said, it's a great one to get you going. It clarifies the person's meaning so you don't misunderstand or misrepresent it. It puts you in the driver's seat. Yeah, so I like that a lot. Very valuable. So it doesn't make us nervous or embarrassed or tongue-tied or whatever. We just ask a question. The other person does all the talking. Well, that's Koukl's book. I hope you find it useful. I think it's one of the best books that everybody should have on their shelf. Again, go to str.org and find out more about Koukl and his organization. It's wonderful. Well, thank you for being part of the podcast today. Talk to you later.